Well, listen, let's get a word from Jonathan Reynolds here, because, of course, the owners of Vauxhall have blamed the government's new rules over their decision to shut down the Luton branch. Here's the Business Secretary, Mr Reynolds, speaking yesterday.
I've said repeatedly that for me, decarbonisation cannot mean deindustrialisation. I've got no interest in the country hitting its climate targets by shutting down jobs and industry. That's just not the way it's got to be about that transition. And so, yes, myself and the Transport Secretary, who I work with very closely around this, are looking at that particular policy, that SEV mandate.
Well, there it is. They're looking at the policy. I mean, my fear, well, I've got lots of fears on this, Steve, but one of them is that I'm not absolutely sure that any of these people involved in this equation, Louise Hay, Transport Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, Business Secretary, I don't think they know anything about the brief that they're in charge of.
Yeah, and that's why targets are the worst thing. I think we've all had situations where you have a meeting with the boss, and at the end of the meeting they come up with, like, oh, so let's get that done by next Tuesday. And you think, what? Hey, why are you stipulating something that I hope I'll have to jump through when you are literally pulling that figure out of a part of your body that no one wishes to see? And that's the problem, isn't it? These targets don't make sense. You're putting the cart before the horse, which, by the way, would solve all the problem with pollution. But it's to do with having the successful product. That's what they're missing from this. If you want to have, because it's 28% of all the cars that these manufacturers make should be EVs. Well, why don't you get to the stage when the cars are so darn sexy and good, at least 28% are the ones being sold. Instead, they have this plan where they go, I know, we'll force you to sell 28% EVs, even though people don't want them, they're not quite ready. Yeah. Maybe they're right for early adopters, but they're not ready for your average driver. But we'll just bring in a number, and if you don't hit that number, we fine you. Trust the market a little bit. I'm not like some obsessed with a free market thing, but the invisible hand does not want to drive these cars right now. Yeah. So you've got to let the market develop, and then when the car is good enough, we'll all be. Of course, if an electric car was better than a petrol car, no one would be saying, "I really like to stand next to some flammable liquid every so often in a big forecourt." Yeah,
it's a bit like. I'm thinking of it down in London where Sadiq Khan has got this ULEZ zone thing, and he expanded the ULEZ zone to, if you look at the data, to catch about 17 drivers who are still driving subpar cars. And you're thinking, well, hang on, this is an area that naturally is going to disappear anyway, the high-polluting vehicles, because that's been the direction of travel without anyone's fining anybody or putting a camera up. So the idea to put an entire wall of cameras around the entirety of the M25 to catch this tiny amount of drivers. And, of course, they can still pollute if they want to pay, by the way. That's the other curious nature of that. But the amount of work and money put into that, and this seems like something similar. I think if Reynolds just let it go a little bit and said, look, let's just loosen this and play the game of logic. Manufacturers are aware that electric is probably their future, but it's the targets that they have the problem with.
The target should be on how many forecourts or charging stations or whatever the phrase is. The government could get involved in that. If you need to build an infrastructure in a nation, that's when a government has a role to play. But in terms of controlling the free market, I disagree. And it can be done through tax incentives or something, can't it? You know, here's a little bit of money off your tax if you are reinvesting some of that money in the capital to build charging stations all over the shop. Next thing you know, you've got a system that works. Instead, and this is true of the ULEZ thing as well, it's about being able to answer the question, well, what have you done? Yeah. So they go, well, look what we've done. Look at all the schemes we've put in place. Well, we must mean it because we've come up with loads of schemes, regardless of whether these schemes actually work or not.
It's kind of, I mean, if you factor in as well all the other initiatives about, you know, windmills and solar panels and stuff, I mean, the idea that we are going to do this within this time frame does seem extraordinary. I mean, look, I think they had a bit of notice on the world ending, if that is the aim. I just simply cannot see this all sort of dovetailing into place, Steve, all rather nicely at 2030. There's going to be almost like a kind of clock and some fireworks go off, and Keir Starmer's going, right, we've done it, we are net zero, kids, everything's fantastic. We've got the solar panels, got the electric cars, no one's got a job, but everything's cool.
I love the idea that it was close, because halfway through November it looks like we wouldn't do it, but we did it just before the end of December. Yes. It's an arbitrary figure. This is the problem with an arbitrary deadline. Of course, like every deadline's been missed. point to a time when a government has hit a deadline. They don't. They're over budget. They're over schedule. That's the way it goes. And I suppose there's a motivating factor. If you are dumb enough to need a deadline to get stuff done, then you can impose one. It's like maths homework. But they should be the big boys. They shouldn't have to do this. Well, here's an arbitrary number that we'll aim for. No, just do it at the right pace. Do it at the pace that will work. Within the last year, there's been a breakthrough in solar panel technology. So anything you were doing before then was a bit dumb in comparison to what you're about to do next year. They will be more efficient. So ones built next year will be way better than the ones you rushed through last year.
I think they should do it as a telethon thing, you know, where they literally, you just need Stephen Mulhern on the case, don't you? Because he does that sort of stuff. And he can sort of count it down. And you know, Barbara in Milton Keynes just had another solar panel put on the shed. That's brought us down to 8%. Can we get to then? And they could maybe make it a little more entertaining. Perhaps we join in more then.
Yeah. Oh, the other thing would be if they come up with some government plan to change the calendar. It's the only way they'll hit the target. If they could really slow down the months, some government edict saying each month now will be a month and a half. It's the only way we'll hit net zero by 2030.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Let's move to this story, Steve. Barbara Banda has won the BBC Women's Footballer of the Year award. There was some controversy around her gender. Let's have a listen to her reaction, though, when winning that award.
Hello, Barbara. Sorry to interrupt your team meeting, everyone, but Barbara, we just wanted to deliver a special award for you. You are the BBC Women's Footballer of the Year 2024!
Guys, I think I'm just dedicating this award to every one of you guys who has been there for me. And I have nothing much to say. Just thank you so much, guys. Thank you. I appreciate your support. Thank you.
Well, the controversy, Steve, isn't that Barbara Banda isn't a woman. It's just that she's a woman with some apparent testosterone issues to the level, to the seriousness that she was excluded from the 2022 Women's Africa Cup under the rules over there. That's the controversy. So clearly some people are scratching their head saying, well, how did she win Women's Footballer of the Year with this being her backstory? And I've got a feeling it wasn't the BBC that gave her this, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it also feels like the BBC must be aware of the reputation it's getting and how often it's getting slapped in the press. It feels like it's really sticking your chin out to just receive another wave of attack. This is an interesting case. The debate seems to have moved, doesn't it? A while ago, we would have simply been talking about trans issues, and now we're talking about potential cases of these intersex conditions. I've had to sit down and read the Wikipedia page on it, to be fair, because it's a whole new area of science that I didn't really know about. There seems to be hundreds of different conditions. I don't know where it plays a role in sport, because I don't know enough about sport. I don't know enough about the medicine. It does feel like unless you're going to put a rule in where either it's just down to a chromosomal test, because you can do those easily, or you really got to get involved and have a look under the hood. But you need to make a rule and then stick to that rule, because at the moment what we have is this area of people who may or may not be within that rule, but no one dare ask a question or do a test. Well, then that's guaranteed mess. Well, then,
but if you followed the logic on this, as far as I can see it as well, because it isn't debated that she's a woman, but it's the testosterone. Everybody would have to have a testosterone test, wouldn't they? You'd have to make, there would be a kind of parameter, and if you were outside of it, you can't play, and if you're inside of it, you can.
Yeah, and I guess that's what happened, because they did the test before the Africa Cup. And yeah, that would be a solution to it. It would technically mean, if you were being picky like I am, you wouldn't call it women's football. You'd call it football for those with testosterone under so many millimole per litre, which just goes to show how then it becomes a different category. Could there be a bloke who's got particularly low T who gets a go at this game? You know, you could open up another bag of worms if that's where you keep your worms.